The storm raged like a wild beast, tearing through the night with relentless fury. Rain poured down in thick sheets, drenching everything in its path, turning the dirt road into a sea of mud. The wind howled through the twisted trees, bending their branches as if trying to snap them in half. In the middle of this unforgiving darkness, a lone German shepherd struggled to keep moving. His name was Toby, but it had been a long time since anyone had called him that. His legs trembled with exhaustion. His fur, once thick and proud, was now matted with mud and clung to his thin frame. He had been walking for what felt like an eternity, but every step was harder than the last. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he couldn't stop. But the cold was seeping into his bones, and his strength was fading fast. Then, a sound cut through the storm, a rustling in the underbrush. Toby's ears perked up, his instincts sharpening despite his weakness. Something was out there, watching him. His breath hitched as he strained to listen past the pounding rain. A faint movement, the crack of a twig. Small details, easy to miss, but not for him. He tried to move faster, but his body betrayed him. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the wet ground, his chest heaving. The freezing rain soaked him to the skin, draining what little warmth he had left. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Alone, in the dark, with no one to save him? His eyelids grew heavy. He wanted to fight, but exhaustion had its grip on him. Then suddenly, a burst of light cut through the night. Two beams pierced the darkness, reflecting off the rain-soaked road. Toby blinked, his vision blurred. Headlights. Car was coming. The deep rumble of an engine grew louder, rolling closer with every second. Was this salvation, or just another danger lurking in the shadows? Toby tried to move, tried to stand, but his body was too weak. All he could do was wait, and hope it wasn't too late. If you want to find out what happens to Toby, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to keep bringing you emotional stories like this one. So, you know what to do, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters. The growl of the approaching engine cut through the storm, sending a tremor through Toby's frail body. The headlights sliced through the relentless rain, illuminating the slick road ahead. Would they see him, or would they pass by, leaving him behind in the darkness? He tried to lift his head, but his body was betraying him. His muscles ached, his legs felt like dead weight, and every breath was slow and labored. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but the distant glow of the headlights remained, growing brighter, closer. The truck's tires skidded slightly in the mud before it screeched to a stop just feet away. For a moment, there was only the deep rumbling of the idling engine, as if the driver was unsure of what they had just seen. Then, the metallic creak of a door opening. Heavy boots landed in the puddled dirt with a splash. The sound of footsteps neared, crunching against the soaked ground. Toby's ears flicked, but his body remained still, his instincts battling between fear and surrender. If this was a threat, he had no way to escape it. A shadow loomed over him, blocking the sharp glare of the headlights. A gruff voice cut through the rain, deep but not unkind. "What the hell happened to you, boy?" The man knelt, his face obscured by the downpour, but Toby could see the worry in his posture. He smelled of earth and sweat, his jacket damp from the rain. The man hesitated before reaching out, his fingers brushing against Toby's muddy fur. Toby flinched but didn't have the strength to pull away. The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're freezing and hurt. Damn it. Can you stand?" His voice had softened, but Toby's legs wouldn't move. The attempt sent a fresh wave of pain through his limbs, and he let out a weak, involuntary whimper. His body was giving up, shutting down piece by piece. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, his vision flickering at the edges. Would this be it? After everything, was this how his journey ended? A heavy silence hung in the air, only broken by the pattering rain. Then the man let out a deep breath. All right, I got you. Just hang in there." Toby felt himself being lifted, his body cradled in strong, steady arms. For a brief moment, panic flared inside him. an instinctive fear of being trapped. But the warmth of the man's jacket, the steady beat of his heart against Toby's side, it was comforting. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was holding him with care. Someone had stopped for him. The truck door swung open, and Toby was gently laid onto the worn passenger seat. The dry warmth of the cabin wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The man climbed in, slamming the door shut, sealing them off from the storm. Toby's tired eyes flickered up one last time, trying to make sense of this stranger, this moment. But the exhaustion was too strong. His body, finally given a chance to rest, gave in to the darkness. The truck rumbled down the rain-slicked road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. Inside the cab, the air was thick with the scent of damp fur and old leather. Toby lay curled on the passenger seat, his breathing slow and uneven. His body ached with every bump in the road, but the warmth of the truck was beginning to seep into his frozen limbs. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't completely exposed to the elements. The man behind the wheel kept glancing at him between stretches of road. His hands gripped the steering wheel, fingers tapping absently against the worn leather cover. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with rough hands and tired eyes. The kind of man who had seen his share of hard days. He sighed, running a hand through his damp hair before muttering, "What the hell were you doing out there, boy?" Toby stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, but didn't lift his head. His body was too drained to react. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No collar, no tags, half-starved. Somebody left you behind, didn't they?" His voice was gruff, but there was something else beneath it. Something softer. Understanding. Maybe even guilt. He kept talking more to himself than to Toby. "Yeah, I know what that feels like." The truck slowed as they reached the edge of a small town. The neon glow of an old gas station flickered in the distance, the streets mostly empty this late at night. The man didn't stop. Instead, he turned onto a winding back road, heading towards something more isolated. Toby barely noticed. His head was sinking deeper into the seat, his eyes fluttering closed, but his ears still twitched at every unfamiliar sound. Even in his exhaustion, he wasn't sure if he was safe yet. After a few more minutes, the truck pulled into a long gravel driveway, tires crunching against the wet stones. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, and beyond the windshield, a small cabin stood against the backdrop of dark woods. The porch light cast a weak glow, reflecting off puddles that had formed along the path. With a heavy sigh, the man put the truck in park and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt thick, pressing against Toby's ears. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man turned to him, rubbing a hand over his face before pushing the door open. "All right, let's get you inside." The cold rushed back in as he stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the mud. He reached over, opening the passenger door, and Toby felt the warm air escaping into the night. The man hesitated, looking at him with an expression Toby couldn't quite place. Then, with a quiet grunt, he leaned down and carefully lifted the tired shepherd into his arms once again. Whatever was waiting inside that cabin, it had to be better than what he had left behind. The cabin door creaked open, releasing a wave of warmth into the cold night air. Inside, the dim glow of a single lamp flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows across the modest space. The air smelled of aged wood, faint traces of coffee, and something familiar, something Toby couldn't quite place. It wasn't home, but it didn't feel like danger either. The man carried him inside carefully, his boots thudding against the worn wooden floor. He hesitated for a moment, then gently placed Toby onto an old plaid blanket near the fireplace. The warmth from the dying embers brushed against Toby's damp fur, making his muscles relax involuntarily. For the first time in days, he wasn't bracing himself for the next struggle. But exhaustion still had its grip on him, pulling him deeper into its hold. The man stepped back, watching him. His rough hands rested on his hips, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he crouched down beside Toby and muttered, "I don't know if you can hear me, but you got lucky tonight. That storm would have swallowed you whole." He ran a hand through his short, graying hair before shaking his head. "Hell, maybe I got lucky too. Been a long time since I had company out here." Toby's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. There was something familiar about the man, not in scent, but in presence. A weight he carried, something unsaid. Toby recognized it because he carried the same weight. A past he couldn't outrun. A silence filled with things he didn't understand. He let out a slow breath and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The man stood, walking toward the kitchen, where the faint clinking of metal and glass echoed through the cabin. Moments later, he returned, kneeling beside Toby again with a small bowl of water. "Here, try this. You look like you haven't had a drink in days." He pushed the bowl closer, watching as Toby weakly sniffed at it before finally lapping at the water, his throat burning with relief. The man watched in silence for a moment before leaning back against the old wooden chair nearby. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. "Guess we both got some ghosts chasing us? Huh?" His voice was quieter now, almost distant. Outside, the storm had begun to settle, but inside that cabin, the past still lingered like a shadow neither of them could shake. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a warmth that Toby had almost forgotten existed. His fur was still damp, but the heat slowly seeped into his aching muscles, loosening the tightness in his limbs. He lay curled on the plaid blanket, his body too weak to move, yet his mind refused to rest. Even in safety, the echoes of the past wouldn't let him go. The man sat nearby in an old wooden chair, staring into the flames. He held a worn coffee mug between his hands, though he hadn't taken a sip in a while. His thoughts were somewhere else, lost in the same silence that had settled between them. Outside, the storm had faded to a quiet drizzle, tapping gently against the cabin's roof. The air inside was still, heavy with something unspoken. After a long pause, the man exhaled and finally broke the silence. "You remind me of something I lost a long time ago," he muttered, his voice low and rough. He glanced at Toby, his eyes shadowed with something deeper than exhaustion. "Had a dog once. Looked a lot like you. Smart, strong, loyal." His fingers tightened around the mug, the wood of the chair creaking slightly beneath his weight. "But life has a way of taking things from you, don't it?" Toby's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but he remained still. He didn't know this man's story, but he understood loss, the feeling of something being ripped away, leaving behind only emptiness. Maybe that's why he didn't feel the need to run anymore. Maybe they were both just tired. The man leaned forward, setting his untouched coffee on the floor beside him. "You got a name, boy? Someone waiting for you out there?" His voice was softer now, but the question lingered in the air, unanswered. Toby didn't have an answer to give. The only thing waiting for him out there was the cold, the hunger, the fear. He lowered his head onto his paws, his breathing steady but heavy. The man sighed and rubbed his face with one hand before standing up. "All right, get some rest. We'll figure this out tomorrow." His footsteps were slow and deliberate as he walked toward the back of the cabin. The door to another room creaked open, then closed softly behind him. The fire continued to flicker, casting moving shadows across the wooden walls. Toby listened to the quiet, the steady hum of the night settling in. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't afraid of falling asleep. This story hits deep. The bond between Toby and the man, both carrying their own pain, is so powerful. Sometimes the most unexpected connections heal the deepest wounds. Who else felt emotional reading this? The fire had burned low, leaving only a soft glow that flickered across the wooden walls. The storm outside had faded to nothing more than a gentle mist, but inside the cabin, the air still felt heavy. Toby shifted slightly on the blanket, his muscles aching from exhaustion. Sleep should have come easily, but something inside him refused to let go. His ears twitched at every small sound, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of the old cabin settling, the quiet rhythm of the man's breathing from the other room. It was peaceful, far more than he was used to. Too peaceful. His body was safe, warm, but his mind still lingered on the dark roads he had walked to get here. How long had he been running? And from what? The memories were blurred, tangled in hunger and fear. All he knew was that he had lost something. Someone. A sharp gust of wind rattled the window pane, and Toby's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded for a brief moment before he forced himself to relax. He wasn't out there anymore. He was here, inside, alive. He let out a slow breath, resting his head back on his paws. But just as his body began to surrender to the warmth of the fire, a new sound reached his ears, one that didn't belong to the night. It was distant, almost imperceptible, a crunch of gravel, a faint shuffle barely audible. Footsteps. Toby's body tensed, instincts kicking in before his exhaustion could hold him down. His ears perked up, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Someone was out there. He lifted his head slowly, eyes locked on the front door. Was it just his imagination? Or was someone, really standing just beyond the porch? The minutes stretched long, and the silence deepened. Then, as if the night itself had swallowed whatever presence had been there, the sound was gone. Toby remained still, listening, waiting. Nothing. Only the wind, the trees, the distant call of the wild. But the unease in his chest didn't fade. He wasn't sure why, but something told him this wasn't over. Toby remained perfectly still, his ears perked, his body tense. The cabin was quiet again, but the feeling in his chest hadn't faded. Something had been out there. He was sure of it. His instincts, sharpened by survival, told him that silence didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it meant something or someone was waiting. He slowly lifted his head, sniffing the air. The damp scent of rain lingered, mixed with the smoky warmth of the fire. But beneath it all, there was something else. Faint, foreign, a scent that didn't belong here. His heartbeat quickened. He had smelled this before, somewhere in the haze of his past. But where? And why did it send a chill through him? From the other room, the man stirred, shifting in his sleep. Toby flicked his ears toward the sound but kept his focus on the door. He didn't want to wake him, not yet. Not unless he was sure. The last thing he wanted was to seem restless for no reason. But deep down, he knew his instincts weren't wrong. They had never been wrong before. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Still, Toby waited. The only sound was the slow crackling of the dying fire and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. His body begged for rest, but his mind refused to let go. His paws twitched slightly, as if preparing to move. If something was out there, it could still come back. Maybe it already had. Then, just as he started to convince himself that the night would remain uneventful, he heard it again. A noise, this time closer. A soft creak like weight shifting against wood. His breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted toward the door. The porch. Someone was standing there. Toby didn't move. He barely breathed. The handle of the door sat still in the dim firelight, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, at any second, it might turn. Something was coming. He could feel it. And this time, he wouldn't be caught unprepared. Toby remained motionless, his body tense, ears pricked forward. The air inside the cabin felt different now. Thicker, heavier, charged with an invisible force that made every muscle in his body coil with instinct. Something was wrong. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle outside, but that eerie silence, the kind that came when something unnatural disturbed the night, had settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. The scent was still there, just beyond the door. Faint, unfamiliar, but carrying a weight that made the fur along Toby's spine prickle. This wasn't the scent of the man who had taken him in. It wasn't the scent of the woods, the earth, or the lingering traces of rain. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong. His breath was steady, but his heartbeat pounded in his chest. He had smelled this before, but where? And why did it set every nerve in his body on edge? Then it happened. A shadow moved outside, just barely. A shift in the dim glow of the porch light, a flicker of darkness against the misty air. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Toby's muscles tensed beneath his fur. If they had just been passing by, they would have kept moving. But they hadn't. They were standing there. A knock. Soft, deliberate, too careful, too controlled. It wasn't the frantic banging of someone in distress, nor the casual rap of a neighbor stopping by. It was a test, a calculated sound, meant to see if anyone inside would respond. Toby's ears flicked toward the noise, but he didn't move. He stayed low, his body pressed into the blanket, his breathing quiet. Whoever was outside, they weren't in a hurry. That was worse. From the other room, the man stirred in his sleep, shifting beneath the weight of old blankets. Toby didn't turn his head, didn't dare take his eyes off the door. If the stranger knocked again, the man would wake up. But was that a good thing? Or was it better to stay still, to let whoever was outside think the cabin was empty? Then the doorknob turned. Slowly, quietly, a careful, deliberate twist, testing the lock. Toby's breath hitched, but he remained still, every muscle bracing for what would come next. Whoever was out there wasn't just some lost traveler. They weren't knocking for help. They were trying to get in. Then came the voice. Low, measured, carrying through the wooden door like a whisper cutting through the silence. I know you're in there. Not a question. Not a threat. Promise. The cabin was eerily still, but Toby's senses were on high alert. He could feel it. Something was about to happen. His heartbeat pounded in his chest, every muscle in his body tense and coiled like a spring. The doorknob had stopped moving, but that didn't bring any relief. Whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. That was the most unsettling part. There was no frantic pounding, no desperate calls for help, just patience, quiet persistence, a slow, creeping presence that sent a chill through the air. Toby's ears flicked as he tried to pick up every sound beyond the door. The wind had died down, the night eerily calm, as if holding its breath. The rain had faded to nothing more than a faint mist, leaving behind only the distant rustling of wet leaves. But there was another sound, one so faint that only Toby's sharp instincts could catch it. Breathing, slow, measured breathing. Someone standing just inches from the other side of the door, waiting. Then, another knock, this time firmer. Not aggressive, not rushed, but deliberate. As if whoever was outside wasn't asking for permission to enter, but rather announcing that they were already here. The knock wasn't a question, it was a statement. And then came the voice again, low and calm, but carrying something underneath. Something unsettling. I know someone's in there. No need to be rude. Toby's body stiffened. The voice held no fear, no hesitation. Only certainty. Whoever they weren't lost, and they weren't looking for shelter. They had come for a reason. But what? Toby's instincts told him that this wasn't someone who would simply walk away. He had encountered threats before, but this was different. This was someone who wasn't afraid. From the other room, the creak of the old bed broke the silence. The muffled rustling of blankets. A groggy exhale. Then, a gruff, sleep-thickened voice. What the hell? The man shifted, sitting up, his movements sluggish at first. Toby flicked his ears in his direction but didn't take his eyes off the door. He couldn't. Not now. The floorboards groaned under the weight of slow, heavy footsteps. The man appeared in the dim firelight, rubbing a hand over his tired face. His brow furrowed as his gaze landed on Toby, still frozen in place, body stiff as stone. He paused. His expression changed, the haze of sleep vanishing, replaced by sharp awareness. He saw it too. He felt it. Something was wrong. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant dripping of rain from the trees outside. Then, the man's voice, now fully awake, cut through the silence. Who's out there? His tone was steady, firm, but Toby could hear the tension behind it. He didn't like this either. A beat of silence. The air felt heavy, pressing against the walls of the cabin. And then, finally, came the reply. The same calm voice, just as slow, just as deliberate. We should talk. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls had closed in just slightly, trapping the thick tension inside. Toby's breath was steady, but every muscle in his body remained tight, poised for whatever came next. The man hadn't moved from his spot near the door, his fingers hovering just inches from the handle. Outside, the stranger waited, unmoving, patient. The weight of their presence seeped through the wood, filling the room like a cold draft. The man exhaled, slow and controlled. "Talk about what?" His voice was low, edged with suspicion. He wasn't the kind to open his door to just anyone, and something about this visitor set off every alarm inside him. Toby could sense it. This wasn't an old friend. This wasn't a lost traveler. This was something else. A long silence stretched between them. Then, the voice outside spoke again. Still calm, still certain. "About the dog." Toby's ears twitched. "Him." The man's expression darkened. His grip on the doorknob tightened, knuckles whitening. "I don't know what you're talking about." The words were firm, final, a warning. But the stranger didn't back down. Instead, they let out a slow breath, almost amused. "Oh, I think you do." A pause. "Then, you don't know who he is, do you?" The man hesitated just for a second, but Toby noticed. He could feel the shift. Another pause. Then the voice outside lowered, as if speaking a secret meant only for them. "That dog didn't just wander into that storm. Someone put him there, and someone's looking for him." Toby didn't move. He barely breathed. Looking for him? Why? The images flashed through his mind. Running, pain, the rain pounding against his back. The feeling of escape, of barely making it out. He didn't remember everything, but he knew one thing for certain. He had been running from something. The man finally spoke, his voice quieter this time. "And who the hell are you?" The stranger chuckled softly, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Just someone who thought you should know." Before they come looking for him, a shuffle of movement, footsteps retreating down the steps. Then silence. No lingering presence, no last words. Just the night swallowing the stranger whole. The man stood frozen, staring at the door as if expecting the visitor to return. Toby watched him closely, sensing the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened. Then, slowly, the man stepped back, away from the door. He wasn't opening it. Not tonight. A long breath escaped him as he ran a hand through his hair. Then, finally, he turned, looking at Toby. Really looking at him. For the first time, his expression wasn't just concern. It was something deeper, something heavier. Who was Toby? And what had he escaped from? The man exhaled again, glancing once more at the door before shaking his head. "Looks like we got some things to figure out, boy." Toby didn't know what was coming next. But as the fire crackled softly beside him, the man still standing by his side. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running alone. If you enjoyed Toby's story, leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling story. Comment below your thoughts.